What if the entire story of your life fit on half a page? Not a summary, not a highlight reel, just half a page. A few sentences about who you were, what you believed, and whether you tried to pass on something worth keeping to the next generation. That is the essence of Jarom and Omni. 7 writers, roughly 200 years of Nephite history, and the entire narrative fits in fewer than 40 verses. Tonight, we're going to examine those 40 verses closely, because what these writers chose to include and what they chose to leave out reveals the nature of faith, the burden of inheritance, and what it truly means to keep a record when you are not sure anyone is reading. Welcome back to Covenant Chronicles. We are 9 episodes into the Nephite saga, and we have just crossed into some of the most neglected territory in the entire Book of Mormon. Most readers sprint through Jarom and Omni, they note the names, register the passage of time, and move on to the words of Mormon as quickly as possible. That is a mistake. Tucked inside these 40 verses is one of the most honest and psychologically complex sequences in the small plates. A series of men handed a sacred responsibility they did not ask for, writing into what must have felt like a void, uncertain if any of it would ever matter. They were wrong, of course. It matters enormously. But they didn't know that, and that is exactly why they are worth our attention. Let me introduce you to the writers of Jarom and Omni, because each one is distinct, and those differences tell the story. The first is Jarom, son of Enos, grandson of Jacob. He opens his record with something that sounds almost like an apology. He states he will not record his prophecies or revelations because what his fathers wrote is sufficient. He has things he could say, yet he chooses silence. He is already editing himself, conscious that space is limited and the purpose of the record is specific. What Jarom does provide is a snapshot of a civilization at a particular crossroads. The Nephites, he tells us, are numerous. They have spread across the land, observing the law of Moses and keeping the Sabbath. On the surface, they are doing exactly what is expected. Jarom, however, is not naive. He knows that external compliance and internal conversion are not synonymous. He spends significant energy describing the prophets, priests, and teachers who labored constantly to prevent hardness of heart. While the civilization looked healthy from the outside, the interior required constant vigilance. This tension between the appearance of faithfulness and the reality of it is one that every religious community in every era has faced. Jarom names it plainly. The people needed to be stirred up continually. They needed to be reminded of death, the duration of eternity, and the judgments of God. Left to their own devices, they drifted. They always drifted. And this is worth pausing on, because Jarom is describing something that sounds uncomfortably modern. A civilization that checks all the external boxes. Attending the right services, observing the right days, following the right regulations, but whose hearts are elsewhere. The prophets and priests are not preaching to pagans, they are preaching to believers who have let the center go cold. They're trying to maintain the temperature of faith in people who already consider themselves faithful. This is among the most challenging pastoral dilemmas. It is much easier to convert someone who has never believed than to rekindle the fire in someone who believes they already possess enough. Jarom knew this. He watched it happen. And he records it not as condemnation, but as honest observation. This is what it costs to keep a civilization spiritually alive. It costs constant labor, constant reminding, constant stirring. Jarom writes for 15 verses and then passes the plates. He was faithful with what he was given. He did not inflate his record or pretend to have more to say than he did. There is integrity in that restraint. But before we leave Jarom, there is one more thing worth noting. He tells us the Nephites are stronger than the Lamanites in military terms because of the strength of the Lord. And yet, he does not dwell on that. He does not celebrate military victory or national greatness. What he chooses to emphasize, the thing he cares most about, is the spiritual condition of the people's hearts. The wars are almost a footnote. The hardness of heart is the real battle. That tells us something about what Jarom understood his record to be for. It was not a national chronicle, it was a spiritual one. And the spiritual condition of the people was always more fragile, more urgent, and more worth writing about than any military outcome. And then the plates pass to Omni. Omni is one of the most startlingly honest writers in the entire Book of Mormon. He provides only 3 verses. In that brief space, he confesses, "I of myself am a wicked man. I have not kept the statutes and the commandments of the Lord as I ought to have done." Read that again. This man is writing in a sacred record, an inheritance passed to him with solemn responsibility. And his first act is to admit he is not the man his father was. He is not performing righteousness. He is telling the truth in the most compressed, unsparing way possible. Those 3 verses are more psychologically honest than most religious writing, 10 times their length. Think about the courage that took. He could have written nothing. He could have filled the space with generalities about God's goodness. Instead, he chose to include the most damaging information about himself because the record required honesty, not a performance. There is something in Omni that most readers miss. He is not a warning. He is a witness. He is proof that a sacred trust can be carried even by imperfect hands, that the covenant can travel through a generation of someone who struggled to live up to the standard and still arrive intact on the other side. This matters more than it might seem. We tend to imagine the chain of covenant transmission as a succession of heroes. Omni breaks that illusion. He is a man who received something he knew he was not worthy of, held it for his generation, and passed it on, and the covenant survived. This is not an argument for complacency. Omni is saying something more difficult, that the work of God does not depend entirely on the quality of the vessel. The record has a life beyond the individual, even an imperfect person, if they are honest enough to tell the truth and careful enough not to destroy what they were given, can serve the purposes of God. Most of us will not be Enos. We will not wrestle all night and hear a voice from heaven. Most of us will be closer to Omni, imperfect people who received something precious, did our best with it, and made sure it reached the next generation. Omni tells us that is enough. The chain continues. After Omni comes Amaron. He writes 5 verses and passes the plates. Then Chemish, the brother of Amaron, 2 verses. He simply notes that he writes with his own hand to fulfill the commandment of his father. He is not a protagonist, he is a custodian. Then Abinadom, 2 verses. He tells us of war and contention. He has wielded the sword in defense of his people. He speaks plainly like a soldier, without drama or apology. He admits he has been given no new revelation. He is a warrior who happened to receive a sacred record. He passes it on. Notice what is happening across these 4 writers: Omni, Amaron, Chemish, and Abinadom. They are all doing roughly the same thing, receiving a sacred object they did not choose, writing the minimum honest amount, and passing it forward. None of them had spectacular spiritual experiences to report. None of them were visited by angels or given visions. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, people who happened to be born into a line of covenant responsibility and who chose, each in their generation, not to be the one who dropped it. There is a lesson here that is easy to miss because it requires us to value something our culture does not typically value: the faithfulness of the unremarkable. We celebrate figures like Nephi and Enos, the ones who had visions, who heard voices, who transformed their people. We do not celebrate the Chemishes, but God apparently does, because Chemish's 2 verses are scripture. They are in the canon. They were preserved across centuries and civilizations and translations. God thought Chemish was worth including. That should change the way we think about our own role in the covenant. Most of us will never have a vision. Most of us will never write anything that gets read beyond our own family. But if we receive something precious and pass it on intact, if we are the link that does not break, then we have done something that from the perspective of eternity is not small at all. There is a kind of heroism in that which does not look like heroism at all. It looks like duty. It looks like showing up. It looks like 2 verses from a soldier who killed men in battle and had nothing revelatory to add, but who made sure the plates did not disappear on his watch. We do not celebrate Abanadom. We do not teach lessons about Chemish. But indeed, the Book of Mormon as we know it would not exist without them. And then comes Amaleki, and everything changes. Amaleki writes 18 verses, nearly half of the entire Book of Omni, and provides one of the most significant historical accounts in the small plates. He tells us about the original Messiah who was warned by God to flee the land of Nephi. Guided only by the voice of God, they discovered the people of Zarahemla, the Mulekites, who had left Jerusalem during the Babylonian conquest. This discovery is staggering. Lehi's family were not the only ones God brought to the Americas, but the contrast is precise. The Nephites kept records obsessively. Because they kept the records, they kept the thread. They could still read the covenant and trace their lineage back to the voice of God. The Mulekites, who kept no records, had lost everything, including their language and their memory of God. They were not bad people. They simply let the words drift out of circulation. Generation by generation, the language shifted. The stories blurred. The names of the prophets faded. And without the written word to anchor the theology itself became unmoored. This is the most frightening passage in the small plates, not because of war or pride or antichrists, but because of forgetting. The quiet, gradual, entirely unremarkable process by which a people loses its theological center simply by failing to write things down and read them again. The Book of Mormon argues that the Word of God must be actively maintained. It does not preserve itself. It must be written, taught, and defended in every generation, or it will fade. Not dramatically, not all at once, but fade it will. Amaleki also records the story of Coriantumr, a man found living among the Mulekites whose name and story connect Jarom and Omni to something far larger than the Nephite narrative. Coriantumr was not a minor figure. He was the last king of the Jaredites, a people who had come to the Americas centuries before Lehi, led across the ocean by the brother of Jared, whose faith was so complete that he saw the finger of the Lord. The Jaredites built a great civilization, and then they destroyed it entirely, through pride, through war, through the rejection of every prophet God sent them. The Book of Ether, which we will explore later in this series, records that catastrophe in devastating detail. But here, in Omni, before we have read a single verse of Ether, Coriantumr appears. A ghost. A survivor who outlived everyone he knew, wandering among a people whose language he could not speak, carrying in his body the last memory of a civilization that no longer existed. He lived among the Mulekites for 9 months, and then he died. And Mosiah read the engraving on the stone that preserved his story. What does it mean that God preserved that stone? That Mosiah could read it? That Amaleki chose to include it here? It means this. God's gaze was not fixed solely upon the Nephites. He had been watching the Jaredites for centuries before the Nephites existed. He sent them prophets. He warned them. he wept over their vineyard the same way he wept over Israel's. And when they destroyed themselves, he preserved one witness, one stone, one survivor, so that the record would not be entirely lost. The same God who answered Enos in the forest is the God who led the brother of Jared across the ocean in darkness. The same God who wept in Jacob 5 is the God who preserved Coriantumr's stone. He is not the God of one people. He is the God of every civilization he has ever called into covenant yesterday, today, and forever. And that stone sitting in the hands of Mosiah among the people of Zarahemla is one of the quietest and most powerful proofs of his constancy in the entire Book of Mormon. Finally, at the end of his life, having no heir, Amaleki broke the pattern of family inheritance and gave the plates to King Benjamin. He understood that the conduit matters less than the covenant it carries. The record was not a family heirloom, it was a covenant document, and it needed to go wherever the covenant could be best protected and carried forward. This act, handing the sacred record to a king rather than a son, is one of the most quietly significant moments in the transition from the small plates to the larger Nephite record. Amaleki is not just passing an object, he is making a decision about what the record is for. It is not for his family's prestige or his legacy. It is for the covenant, for the people who will read it, for the God who preserved it, and for the future generations who will need it more than Amaleki could imagine. We do not know what Benjamin said when Amaleki handed him the plates. We do not know if there was ceremony or solemnity, or simply a quiet transfer between two faithful men at the end of a long life. But we know what Benjamin did with them. He treasured them, he used them, he built on them. And it is because of that transfer, because Amaleki was wise enough to know that his job was to preserve, not to own, that the record survived. Amaleki's final plea mirrors Jacob's from generations earlier. Come unto Christ with full purpose of heart. Not a divided heart, not a partially committed heart. The heart that comes to God fully is not necessarily the heart that has everything figured out. It is the heart that has decided, without reservation, which direction it is going. What do we take from Jarom and Omni? These 40 verses are the sound of ordinary people doing an extraordinary thing. Maintaining a covenant through generations when no angels appeared, when no voice came from heaven, when the work was simply showing up and passing something forward. Without Chemish and Abinadom, the plates never reach Amaleki. Without Amaleki, they never reach Benjamin. Without Benjamin, they never reach Mormon. And the Book of Mormon, as we have it today, would not exist. Every link matters, even the ones that fit in 2 verses. The record does not require perfection, it requires honesty. Faithfulness often looks like showing up when you have nothing spectacular to say. The written word is our anchor against the drift of time. The Mulekites prove what happens when that anchor is lost. And in every generation, across every civilization God has ever watched over, the invitation remains the same. Come with full purpose of heart. There is something worth sitting with in that phrase. Amaleki does not say come when you feel ready. He does not say come when your doubts are resolved or your life is in order. He says come with full purpose, with your entire intention aimed in one direction. The heart that comes to God fully is not necessarily the heart that has everything figured out. It is the heart that has decided without reservation which direction it is going. Jarom's people drifted because they never made that decision fully. The Mulekites lost their God because no one in their generation chose to actively maintain the thread. Omni received the plates despite his unworthiness because he was honest enough to carry them without pretending to be more than he was. All of them, in their different ways, are asking us the same question. The same question the entire small plates have been building toward since Lehi left Jerusalem. Not, do you believe? But, Which direction is your whole heart pointed? The record was kept so that you could read it, and having read it, you would know what to do. Next week, we reach a great turning point. The words of Mormon and the powerful address of King Benjamin, one of the most theologically precise and emotionally charged sermons in all of Scripture. Don't walk the wilderness alone. Subscribe. Come back next week. We'll continue the journey. This is Covenant Chronicles, straight to the point and straight to the heart. I'll see you in the next video.